Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. I am Lane Krempos. I'm the Director of Integration at notMYkid. I am really excited. Today we have Loretta Mueffelman. Loretta is the Clinical Director at notMYkid, and she's going to be sharing with us information, resources, all the great things regarding trauma and ACEs, aka Adverse Childhood Experiences. Loretta joined the notMYkid team in June of 2022, and she currently works as our clinical director of the behavioral health programs. If you would like more information about these programs, please do look at our website. We offer a continuum of support, and our clinical department is such a huge piece within that continuum. Loretta has over 10 years of mental health experience working with children, adolescents, and families who have experienced trauma in their life. Loretta has experience working in direct outpatient and inpatient care settings along with other community-based partners. She received her undergraduate from Arizona State University and her graduate from Argosy University with a degree in clinical mental health and is a licensed professional counselor. Loretta is also a certified clinical trauma professional with training in different treatment modalities, including trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing, San-Tray, trust-based relational interventions, and the neurosequential model of therapeutics. Her passion is being part of a person's journey to healing and providing support for professionals in the field. Loretta spends her spare time with her 2 children and her husband watching movies and having dance parties, which I think we can all appreciate. Loretta, thank you so much for taking time with us and sharing the information that you have with our guest today. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I hope that you guys get some applicable stuff to implement in your daily lives and it's helpful. So today we're going to be talking about trauma and ACEs. Our agenda is I'm going to talk to you about what trauma is and how our body responds when we've experienced something traumatic or even stress in general. And then we're going to talk about the adverse childhood experiences. And then I'm going to give you some resiliency and protective factors and talk about how we can implement them into our everyday lives. So trauma is an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects. When somebody experiences a traumatic event or a continuum of events, the world no longer feels like a safe place, and they don't feel safe, and they feel like they can't keep themselves safe in the world around them. Some types of trauma that people can endure is acute, which acute means single isolated, such as a car accident. It's a single event. Chronic means repeated and prolonged in traumatic experiences. It could be chronic bullying, chronic poverty related to stressors, exposure to war, long-term illness would fall into a chronic trauma. Complex trauma is often within the caregiving system. However, it can also mean that there's multiple layers of trauma. So it's not just one event, it's a series of events, it's ongoing, and it could be a few different types of trauma. So that's what complex would mean. And then we have historical or racial trauma, so that's experienced by a group across generations. So this slide provides a lot of information about what the prevalence of trauma is in our youth and in our world today. So 2 of 3 children and youth were exposed to violence in the past year. Granted, this information comes from 2015 and even later as 1998. So I think it's important to recognize that this data is a little bit out of date, and we probably have a higher rate of some of these adverse experiences because of what happened to us in COVID. So for our children, they could view the isolation piece that happened during the COVID pandemic as something traumatic. And I'll talk a little bit more about why in the upcoming slides. So this touches a little bit about what adversive childhood experiences are. It's called the ACE study. And so what they found was when we've experienced trauma, it has a negative ongoing impact on our overall health and well-being. So yes, trauma can impact the way that our brain functions and the way that we perceive the world, but it also can impact our general health. So there's higher rates of heart disease, obesity, blood pressure. So I think that's important to recognize and just know. So 1 in 5 adults report 3 or more aversive experiences as children. The ACE, I'll go into more of what the ACEs is on the next slide, so that way you get a good idea of what that means. On this slide, I think it's also important to note that 50% report more than one form of victimization, and 1 in 6 report 6 or more exposures to violence. Another thing that I think is something to be recognized is the lifetime rates of physical assault are at a 56% for boys and 47% for girls. So this just gives us kind of a snapshot of the prevalence of trauma and how it really does happen more often than we would suspect or think. So the adverse childhood experiences is the study where it's a questionnaire, it's 10 questions, and essentially the more questions that you respond yes to, the higher your ACE score is. The higher your ACE score is been linked and researched to have a negative impact on our overall health and mental well-being. So that's including the higher rates of obesity, higher rates of heart disease, cardiac issues, blood pressure, things like that. So it's about the period between 0 to 17. So if you took your ACE score or you took this questionnaire, you would be looking at and thinking about answering these questions as they apply from 17 and under. So it's as a child. Traumatic events can include abuse, feeling unloved, family disconnection, divorce, parental substance use, domestic violence, significant mental health in the family, and parental imprisonment. So the ACEs questionnaire touches in all of these areas. The ACEs are also linked to our chronic health problems, as I said before, including our mental health and also substance abuse problems in adolescence and adulthood. So essentially, the higher our ACE score, the more likely we may be impacted, or we may we have a predisposition to use substances or develop a substance use problem. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was children growing up with toxic stress may have difficulty forming healthy and stable relationships. And if we look at the questionnaire in its entirety, a lot of the questions are geared towards our caregivers and our caregiving ability. And there are everyday life stressors that come upon our way. I'm a mother of 2. So I'm not immune to when life just happens to us, right? And some of the things are just outside of our control, and they have an impact on our children's development and upbringing. It also impacts our ability to be able to be there for our children when we're under high levels of stress. And I'll go into kind of how to combat that and how to recognize our system and how to regulate. Okay, the stress response system. I think it's important to get information and understand how our stress response system impacts our ability to be caregivers, to care for our children and to be there when they need us. So the stress response system is related to our internal workings of our brain and our body. So the brain has an alarm system that is designed to identify threat. And when our brain senses a threat, our survival and emotional parts take over. And I have a really great way of demonstrating what that looks like. And you can use it and apply it with your children and yourself. Triggers can also cause our brain to detect a threat from previous experiences, and it is not necessarily always an actual threat. So I think that part is important, because if we or our children have experienced trauma of some sort in their lives, it changes the way that we perceive the world, and it changes the way we feel about ourselves and whether we can keep ourselves safe. This is related to our stress response system. So something may approach us, and in our minds, our children are having a response, a heightened response. And as parents, we might think like, I didn't even do anything, or I have no idea why you're having that high level of response to this, to whatever the situation may be. And it's important to note that this might be the why, is because our brain will do it automatically. And it's not something where we can tell our brain like, hey, hold on, we're okay. But I do have some ways that we can help our bodies feel calm and regulated when we're starting to feel activated. So from this slide, I just want to reiterate that it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual threat. It's a perceived threat. So more on the stress response system is trauma responses can include fighting, freezing, or fleeing. So our brain's automatic response to trauma or perceived trauma or threats is to fight. I'm going to kick and scream and yell, freeze. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay still, and flee, run away, get out of the situation, go to another room, leave the house, whatever the case may be. When our brain senses a threat, our survival and emotional parts take over. I said that again because I really want to reiterate that it's not our choice on whether we fight, freeze, or flee. So if we're presented with a traumatic experience or event, we don't get to decide how our body responds. Our brain will just do it automatically, and that's a survival thing, right? It's to help keep us safe. And it's a great thing that our brain does that. We just want to be able to have a little bit more control of whether we do it we need to actually be protected and save ourselves and be in survival mode, compared to when it's a perceived threat and not an actual threat, and we can help regulate our system so we have more control over how we respond and react. So in this model, I thought it's helpful. It's a helpful visual. I'm a visual learner. So Dan Siegel developed this hand brain model, and whenever I've done trainings for staff, I've done trainings for educators, I've taught it to my clients, I've taught it to parents, caregivers. I think it's helpful. It's a helpful visual for us to understand how our brain functions when we're under stress or when we're experiencing a traumatic experience. So if you take your hand, down here is our survival brain, or the brainstem, and that is responsible for our ability to have just autonomic functioning. So it doesn't take any thought. This helps us with our breathing. When we want to walk, our bodies just do it. It helps with our temperature. So anything that we don't need to think about, our brainstem takes over. So it also is part of our survival strategies as well. So this is the part of the brain that takes over when there's a perceived or actual threat happening. That's important to know. So in here is our limbic system. And this is our expression, emotional parts of us, our ability to regulate our feelings. This is also where our memories are stored and where we develop attachment and relationships. If you put your thumb across, this little part is our amygdala, and it says smoke alarm because this is important to note. So our amygdala is what receives the information and decides really quickly whether we're in survival mode or whether we're okay. So it's our smoke detector. And sometimes it malfunctions or it's on high alert when we've experienced trauma. There's been lots of research that shows that when trauma happens, it impacts our amygdala, and our amygdala is really quick to respond when we've experienced trauma. So if we put our fingers down, this part of our brain is our prefrontal cortex. So that's this part. This deals with us being able to critically think, learn, problem solve. This is part of our brain is what we need in order to make good, healthy decisions, conscious decisions, whether I'm going to choose to do that or I'm going to choose to do this. And if I do, then I understand the consequence that comes with it. So for our kids, this part of their brain needs to be online for them to learn and also be able to make good, sound decisions. This also isn't fully developed until I think 25 to 30 now. So it's important to note that if we have a expectation of a toddler, their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And I have a toddler and his isn't. So we have to parent a little bit differently for our kiddos that are small, young, or have experienced trauma. Their prefrontal cortex may be underdeveloped as well, compared to, let's say you have an 18-year-old who just graduated high school. Their ability to make good decisions might be a little bit better than a toddler. When we have experienced stress or a perceived threat, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So there's no stimulation going to our prefrontal cortex, and all that's left that takes over is our brain stems, so our autonomic functioning, our ability to fight, flight, or freeze, keep ourselves safe. Our amygdala is saying, hey, something bad is happening and we need to do whatever we can to survive. Our emotional parts, so we're going to respond really emotionally reactive. So these parts are online, but the part that we need in order to make good decisions or maybe respond in a way that's healthy and regulated is not accessible. So it's important. I thought this was helpful. It's helpful for me in my parenting, is when I have my child who's distressed and their brain is offline, I know I can't have that conversation of, let's talk about what happened. Why did you do that? What could you do next time? It's not happening, right? Like they're crying, emotionally reactive. They might be physically like hitting, kicking stuff. So we need to implement other things first to help their brains go back online, and then we can move to the reasoning or kind of the look at what happened and what can we do better next time. So Dan Sinkle coined this hand brain model, and it's super helpful. You can even teach it to your kids of like, oh, look at this is what happens when your brain is offline. And I think knowledge is power, and if you can understand it, it's easier to articulate it and give words to too. So some strategies to overcome our aversive experiences. When you're a child, you don't have the ability to maybe avoid any adversity that comes into our lives. And some of it is out of our control, right? Like we can't pick our parents. We may have grown up in a time where there was lots of gang violence around us, the depression, other things that are just situational that were outside of our control, but it caused us to have an ACE score, right? And so these are some strategies that we can use to help our children minimize their ACE score and also overcome and kind of combat our own personal ACE score. So We can limit the risk of increased number of ACEs for our children, right? So now that we know the impact of these adversity things that just come into our life, we can do things to kind of prevent them. We can increase resiliency and protective factors. We can learn skills to regulate our system when we're activated, right? So it's not just children's brains who flip their lid, it's also ours. And I think it's important to note, it's really hard to be a parent, and it's hard to stay regulated and calm in moments where there's a lot going on. And we have our own childhood and attachment wounds that we bring to parenting, and they get like those buttons get pushed all the time, unintentionally, but they get pushed, right? So our lids get flipped, and we can develop the skills to help us regulate our emotions quicker, so that we can be there for our children and help our children through their moments. Resiliency. So Dr. Perry, he's the one who he talks a lot about the neurosequential model of therapeutics. He's the one who created it. It's a way to kind of look and assess on a children's continuum from birth to where they are now. And you could be an adult and still have an assessment done. And one thing that he really talks a lot about, and has talked a lot about the research that shows, is resiliency. So your history of connectedness, so our ability to connect with others, is a better predictor of your health than your history of adversity. So I just talked to you about ACEs and the negative impacts of having a higher ACE score and how it can impact our overall health and well-being. Well, there's also a lot of research that talks about our history, family history, our history as children. And if we had the ability to connect with others in a healthy, meaningful way, that can overset or overcome our adversity. In his work, he talks a lot about relationships. So when I did the training, the NMT is what it's called for short training. One of the things that kept coming up in the articles and the research that was done was this idea about relationships. And it really did change the way that I provide therapy. It changed the way that I view what this child looked like as what they're presenting with or bringing to me. And I found it fascinating that relationships are so helpful in overcoming the adversity. And it can take one person to change a child's trajectory and really help support and combat that adversity. And it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be a family friend, it could be a grandparent, it could be an aunt, an uncle, a cousin. Really, the more healthy relationships a child is exposed to, their adversity can be overcome in whole. It's amazing. So the relationship works to bring the brain back into regulation. And for us as parents, if we use the relationship, the message to our children is that they're not alone. And when somebody's experienced trauma or an adverse childhood experience, which could be from us, right? We often feel like we're alone. It only happened to me. There's a lot of shame that comes along with that. And relationships help those feel not alone and that they're supported and that somebody's there. So Dr. Perry talks about these 3 R's, and these are the steps that we can do as parents to help us get our children so their brains are back online. So, and it may sound counterintuitive. So if we have our child, I have a toddler, he's 3, he's very much tantruming over anything, right? He wants a hot dog. We make him the hot dog, but he didn't want that hot dog. He wants a different hot dog. It makes no sense to me, but in his brain, it's a big deal. So, sometimes as parents, we're so stressed and frustrated that we're like, just eat the hot dog. But what Dr. Perry found to be really helpful in building that sense of connection and that they're not alone is to first regulate. So we have to regulate our own systems in order to be there as a support to help others, right? So if we're in a distress state, our brain is also offline, and it's very easy to be like, eat the hot dog or else. But if we can work as parents to develop the skills to help us regulate quickly, like, oh, I can feel it starting to get like all anxious and tight, I can do something that helps my body get my brain back online. The next step is to relate, is to be able to connect with your child, listen without judgment, easier said than done. I'm a parent, I get it. And try and understand from their perspective and validate their feelings. By validating their feelings doesn't mean that you're saying what you did was okay. So if you have a child who's throwing, hitting, kicking things, breaking stuff, you validating and just listening to what their perspective is not saying like, okay, that's totally fine that you destroy the house. It's saying that I'm just trying to sit with you and understand from your perspective what that was like for you. Once that relational piece comes on, their brains start to regulate and they come back online. And you can tell when your child's not online after a while compared to when they are. And when they start to get back online, you can do a temperature check and ask, are you ready to have the conversation of what we could do better next time? And that's when you go into the reasoning. That's when we go into that autonomic, right? We want a parent right off the cuff. But if we can just wait a second, regulate our own systems, do something that can relate and connect with our children, then we can get to the reasoning piece, which is really, we want them to listen. We want them to hear the why, the what we need them to do, what our expectations are. And we'll never get there if our kids are offline. So a way that we can help provide our children, and if our children have experienced traumatic events or adversity, which a lot of our kids had because of COVID and all the things that came with it. So we can create a safe environment by being predictable with our environment with clear expectations. So my kids know what I expect from them. We create routines. So we do the same thing every morning. We do the same thing when we get home from school. We do the same thing when we do dinner. And we do the same thing that we do every night before bed. So it's important to create predictability when somebody's experienced trauma because it helps create safety and security. I know what to expect from my mom. I know what to expect from my dad, from my grandma, from my uncle, from my teacher. So it's important, and easier said than done, right? Because life happens and we have busy lives and we're all over the place. But the more that we can work to provide routines and predictable, clear expectations, the more our children will feel safe and secure. And the next one is to spend quality uninterrupted time together. So I've done a lot of work with kids. I've done a lot of work with teens. And what I found in just my experiences of being a therapist is our kids want to connect with us, but they may not have the words or they may not know how to ask. So they'll ask in subtle ways, like my daughter wanted to connect with my husband the other night. So she said, I want to throw a ball with you. So that's her way of seeking connection. Sometimes our kids seek connection in maybe not so fun ways. So, like I'm trying to make dinner. I just got home from work. I'm all over the place, feed the dog, let the other dogs out, like all this chaos, right? And so my daughter comes in and she blares the music. She plays Kids Bop. And it's at a 10. And so my lid is quickly getting flipped, right? And then she's like, oh, can I cook with you? I'm like, oh, And I'm like, no, not right now. So then she cries or screams or picks on her brother or whatever the case may be. So that might be a missed opportunity where my daughter was just trying to connect with me and I was in my own head and my lid was flipped and I'm working on like, I got to get stuff done now as quickly as possible so I can move on to the next task. When if I would have taken a moment, breathed, let her do something to help me, which is what she wanted to do, and build that connection, we would have circumvented the outburst. And a way that you can also build a relationship is just schedule it. Like in your mind, take the 5 minutes right before bedtime and really just be with your children. Do game nights. Listen to your favorite music when you were growing up. Do something where you guys can have one-on-one opportunity for conversation and dialogue. So I think sometimes we'll say, okay, we watched a movie together. That was great. Moving on, go to bed. But if we can take a moment and think, okay, what can I do? Can I color or draw with my child? Because that's going to prompt dialogue. Those things are really important. And they mean it's like a lot of money worth to our children when we can connect and spend time with them in our busy lives. Some other protective factors is, so we talked about increasing a sense of safety and security. We talked about the importance of not being alone and feeling belonging. Some other ways that we can do that is just encourage those positive peer relationships. I know that's easier said than done. And their peer relationships can sometimes be out of our control, but there are things that we can do to just really prosper or encourage those healthy relational dynamics, and talk about maybe how some of the relationships are not so healthy, and what to look for in a friend. Having a healthy, caring, positive adult is really, really, really instrumental. It's instrumental that we can be that healthy, caring adult. It's also really instrumental if somebody else outside of our home can also be a support, because sometimes no matter what we do, no matter how cool of a parent we are, no matter how much we try and relate to our children, there might be just something that they don't want to share with us, and they know who they can go to, and they can share it with somebody else who's also safe and that we can trust would support whatever our values, morals, and beliefs are. The family unit has a good support system. So it's really hard, I think, for parents when they don't have their supports and their support needs met. So really trying to find a good support system within the family is a huge protective factor as well. And it also helps with us as parents, right? Not feeling like we belong and we're secure and we're safe. It helps us keep our lids so we're able to use all of our brain and keep our ability to regulate. Caregivers can monitor and provide consistent enforcement of rules and expectations. So again, I think that's related to our children know what we expect from them. That's really important and helpful for them for safety, security, and connection even. Caregivers can demonstrate healthy conflicts, right? So I don't know a family out there that doesn't have some sort of conflict in it at some point. And if we can demonstrate and show what healthy conflict looks like, what a healthy disagreement looks like, and then so if we have a rupture where there's a fight or an argument, we are respectful to each other. We don't raise our voices. We don't break things. We don't throw things. We talk about it. Sometimes we may need to take a break, but we always come back and reconnect. That's super important, because that's Dr. Perry talks about, it's the repairs that really build the resiliency in the relationship. It's not the rupture, because we are going to have fights at some point. We are going to not get along at some point. But if we can really come back and work on the repair and the reconnection, that's where we get the most bang for our buck. Caregivers have the ability to help children work through their issues, right? So even, a 5-year-old is like, oh, somebody's mean to me at school, that we can talk through about that and what that feels like and how to navigate those situations and who to go to for help. That helps provide protective factors. Another thing is having positive interactions with each other. Again, it's really easy as parents to get tunnel vision on the tasks that we have to do, but if we can just take a moment and have a dance party, it's worth more to our children than we will ever know, but we'll see it come back full circle when they come to us for support. Okay, co-regulation. It's important to note, and I'm sure we all know this in the logical parts of our brain, but in the emotional parts of our brain, we have our own stuff that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so it's important to know that our children are going to respond and match our level of regulation, right? So like that instance where I just got home, I've got 1,000 things I got to do. I'm trying to get through my tasks, and I'm already anxious and heightened. Any little thing could happen and my lid's gonna flip right away. If I can recognize that I'm starting to get anxious or amped up or heightened, I can do something to regulate my system, and that will in turn help regulate my child. If my child is having a tantrum or an outburst, if I can respond in a way where I can stay regulated, it will help my child regulate. So we can learn and use regulation skills. Deep breathing, everybody talks about it, and we use it in mindfulness and meditation. But deep breathing is super important because our amygdala, which is that smoke detector, by taking deep breaths, it helps our amygdala kind of like, okay, you're okay, you're okay. And then our brain comes back online. So it's helpful. It's a helpful skill and it's an easy skill to use. But once our brain is flipped, it's hard to think, I'm going to deep breathe because I'm like, right? So if we can just work on deep breathing when we're not heightened, then we'll be able to utilize that skill when we need it. And it's the same thing for our kids. So something that you can do that's relational, if you're in a moment where you're heightened and you're like, I need to take a minute. Maybe you can ask your child, can we just go for a walk together? We're not going to talk about whatever it is that's frustrating us, but let's just get out of the house, go for a walk, go on a bike ride, throw a ball back and forth. That's one, improving the relation, right? So it's saying, I'm not pushing you away. I don't want you to be away from me. I want you to be with me, but I just need to also calm my body. And I think it's okay to verbalize it. Sometimes I'm like, I just need a minute so I can breathe and calm my body. And that helps show our children what they should do when they're starting to feel that elevation. It might sound counterintuitive when our child is having a huge meltdown or outburst or they're struggling. Ask them if they need a hug. Oftentimes that will help their bodies regulate really, really quickly because of that connection and sensory piece. It'll also help our bodies regulate. When we demonstrate the ability to regulate and utilize skills, it teaches our children how to use them as well. I think it's also important to note that if we can teach our children ways to regulate their systems when we're in calm, cool, collected states, if we can front load them with all these different tools that they can use when they're calm, then they can access them when they're not. So it takes practice before we're able to implement it automatically. I wanted to also talk about how our brain is wired. So if we do something over and over and over again, the more likely our brain will use it when we need it. So if we are working on a relationship or we're trying to implement something new and we only do it once or we only do it for a week, and I'm like, okay, I've tried to regulate my system and use deep breathing for a week when my children get elevated or I'm elevated, and it doesn't work. Repetitive patterns of behavior, Dr. Perry talks about this. So the more that we do it, the more it's ingrained in our brain. We're hardwired for regulation. if we use regulation strategies over and over and over and over again. We help our children regulate. If every single time they get frustrated or upset, we see connection with them, they will start to recognize I'm not alone, I'm safe, and I know somebody's going to be there to support me when I need it. So I hope I gave you some really good applicable tools to incorporate in your everyday life. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We do have a clinical department. We have therapy to help provide families and kids who are struggling, who've experienced some traumatic things or just need help with getting skills. So thank you so much. It was an honor to be here, and I hope I gave you something you can take home and use.
Thank you, Loretta. I appreciate always learning from you and with you. For those of you who joined us today, I did put a link in the chat. Please do. It's just going to take a couple, maybe a minute of your time to participate in our survey. Our survey is really important as we get feedback on what we're doing well, how we can grow, and how we can sustain these types of opportunities for our community and for you all. So please, if you have time, fill that out. I will also put it in the chat on our Facebook. In the meantime, thank you so much. And if you do have questions and want to stay on, we're here. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.